For 3/4 of a century, the transatlantic NATO alliance has been a central feature of the international security environment. It stood down the Soviets on the plains of Europe, would intervene in places like the Balkans, and in the aftermath of September 11, 2001, the alliance's mutual defence clause was activated by the United States, setting the stage for troops from across the alliance to deploy to Afghanistan. But despite its immense military power, there have often been tensions running through the alliance, from debates over command and control to long-standing American objections about many allies not hitting their spending targets. But it's over the last couple of weeks where we've seen those tensions and dynamics shift dramatically and publicly, with apparent major US policy swings on the war in Ukraine, European security, and the relationship with Russia, all culminating in a fiery Oval Office event that illustrated these fissures in a way we haven't seen for decades. In the coming weeks, then, we have 3 major questions to ask. 1, what this all might mean for the US and its strategic position. Secondly, what this might mean for Russia and Ukraine. And thirdly, today's question, what about the rest of NATO? Asking what defensive capabilities they might have if the US splits from the rest of the alliance, and what it might take to become more security independent if that decades-old US security umbrella suddenly disappears. To do that, I'll start with a brief bit of history about the alliance and why the French might be treating this as a bit of an I told you so moment, scan through some of the recent indicators of a split between the United States and its NATO allies, and then the core substance of today's question. How much capacity do the Europeans and other allies have to defend themselves without the United States? What are their existing forces, their pain points, and what kind of investments might be required? Before closing out with some economic analysis of Allied defence spending and their capacity to make this happen, and some of the most important unknowns, like the future of Ukraine and its military in Europe's security architecture. But before we jump into it, a quick word from a sponsor. Previously, I introduced you to Odoo, an all-in-one family of business software with 45+ business applications covering a range of purposes. For example, if you want to set up a website quickly, easily, and efficiently, their website builder has you covered. And you've previously seen me working on a Peru website using Odoo. But what if you wanted your website to be a bit more of a web store and integrate some e-commerce functions? Well, you've started to see me show that off too. With Odoo, it's simple enough. First, we generate our website, complete with easy-to-customize theme and layout. Next comes adding products, entering key info like the name and price, and then with a click or two, our product is created. It's then simple enough to customize the page by adding images or adjusting the layout using drag-and-drop content blocks. With some products in place, you could then set up an e-commerce function to help you get them sold. For example, you can enter your tax and banking details, establish an invoice design, set up your delivery options and your payment providers. And just like that, you might be a long way towards your first sales. Odoo allows you to start launching your e-commerce store for free with its lifetime free first app offer. That includes hosting and support, as well as a personalized domain name, free for the first year. So if you're interested, please do check out today's sponsor, Odoo. You'll find a link in the description. And I hope you're looking forward to seeing the website when it's ready to launch later this year. Okay, so while today we really do need to focus on recent events, I want to include just a bit of history on Atlanticism and the US-Europe security relationship in order to help us understand just how enormous a change we might be witnessing, with the major emphasis on the word might there, given how quickly all of this is developing and how many things are still unknown. While today we think of the USA as the world's predominant military superpower, it's fair to say that in the centuries leading up to the First World War, it was almost certainly Europe that had by far the more powerful armies and navies. Going into 1914, for example, the US Army would have been dramatically outnumbered not just by armies like the French, the Germans, or the Russians, but also by the likes of Italy and Austria-Hungary. Meanwhile, the US Navy was growing, but significantly outmatched in terms of both numbers and displacement by the British Royal Navy. The way World War I played out, however, would dramatically adjust the scales. For some European states, World War I meant complete collapse. And even for the nominally victorious states like Britain and France, it meant massive debts, the exhaustion of national resources, and a demographic hollowing out that would have society-wide implications. America, meanwhile, would build up its economic and military capacity, first by selling arms, equipment, and necessary supplies to the Entente states, while also building up its own forces both before and after their entry in 1917. And if World War I shifted that economic and military balance, World War II transformed it. This time, a lot of Europe's civilian and industrial infrastructure that had mostly survived the First War was wrecked from end to end. The British and French colonial empires that had mostly held together in the 20s and 30s began the process of breaking up, sometimes peacefully, sometimes not. To oversimplify, the Europe of the late 1940s and early 50s was broke, America was not, and in security, economic, and financial terms, Washington held just about all the cards. They had an enormous fleet, roaring economy, and they had the atomic bomb. And with the Iron Curtain falling and the Red Army on the borders, the US would quickly move into the position of being the primary security guarantor of a new organization called NATO. From an American perspective, that was probably necessary to stop Moscow dominating Europe and then turning its resources against America's interests. While from the perspective of the exhausted European states, it was just necessary. Full stop. As the Cold War evolved, we did see the military balance in NATO steadily shift. The US was always the alliance's most important military contributor, not least because they had the keys to the vast majority of the alliance's nukes, but many of the European armies also regenerated from their immediate post-war lows. By the 1970s, for example, the West German military, the Bundeswehr, was nearly 500,000 strong, and it was increasingly assumed that these European armies would do a lot more of the fighting and dying at the front if the Cold War ever went hot, while the Americans focused more on their comparative strengths, like slinging nukes and bombing people. A lot of supporters of the NATO arrangements then and now contend that America's support gave Europe the breathing room to regenerate its economy and military capacity. But there are always some sceptical voices, not least of which from Paris. President de Gaulle's relationship with NATO and Washington was especially complicated, and so probably not fully in scope for today's discussion. But among the core concerns were often worries about being overly reliant on American protection. To oversimplify, if the shit ever did hit the fan, would America actually go nuclear, even if its own cities weren't at risk? Would they risk Boston to save the likes of Boulogne, Bergen, or Bristol? In what was not a cheap exercise for the post-war French economy, France would develop its own independent nuclear capabilities in the 1960s, and then field not just strategic nuclear weapons, but also tactical ones as well. Those vehicles on the right there, for example, are Pluton nuclear missile carriers, giving the French military access to a range of independent nuclear escalation options, besides just counter-value city busting. Some of those options would presumably have included nuking Soviet troops on German soil, which I imagine some French figures at the time might have considered a bit of a two birds, one stone scenario. Despite French skepticism, though, it's hard to argue that NATO during the Cold War era didn't accomplish its core mission. The implied goal was to deter a Soviet invasion of Allied Europe, and that invasion obviously never happened. Therefore, some of the tension behind the events we're now seeing play out probably originate more in the post-Cold War era, where every Allied power, including the United States, began to dramatically lower its military expenditure due to the absence of a Soviet-style threat anymore. But in a lot of European capitals, the peace dividend raiser gang would cut a lot more deeply than in Washington. As you can imagine, that debate over defence spending often drew very different perspectives, depending on which side of the Atlantic you were on. A European perspective might argue that, of course, American defence spending was higher given the nation's global interests, while the threat to Europe was dramatically reduced by the collapse of the Soviet Union, and then many of the former Warsaw Pact states actively switching sides, with forces like the Poles, Czechs, and East Germans going from potential adversaries to allies. In Germany's case, some of its disarmament was even mandated by treaty, with the 1990 final settlement with respect to Germany, signed by among others the Soviet Union and United States, mandating steep reductions in force for the newly reunified German state. Plus, European troops would ultimately give their lives more often in American-led conflicts than vice versa. Meanwhile, from an American perspective, many in Europe were engaged in security free-riding. President Bush had pushed for the Allies to spend more on defence as far back as 2007. In 2014, the alliance had agreed a 2% of GDP spending target. But despite setting the target, Washington would often complain that many allies were slow to try and reach it, and essentially relying on the US military and US defence spending to make up the security deficit. And as far as the raw numbers go, Washington had a point. According to NATO expenditure data in 2020, only 9 members besides the United States hit that 2% target. Greece, the UK, Estonia, Poland, Latvia, Lithuania, Romania, and France. Plus at 1.97%, we'll let Norway get in on rounding. 19 other countries fell short, with countries like Belgium and Spain basically phoning it in at 1%. It's worth saying, of course, that it's possible for all of those arguments to be true at the same time. It's possible that low European defence spending was in some cases understandable, that they did contribute to US-led missions, and the US was a major net beneficiary of the alliance as a whole, while it also being true at the same time that countries were falling short of their spending targets and relying on Uncle Sam to cover any gap. From there, though, I'd argue we've seen 2 inflection points. The first was the Russian invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, which seems to have given a number of countries in Europe a somewhat traumatic flashback and triggered a significant increase in spending. In 2020, 9 NATO states other than the US hit that 2% target. In 2024, it was 21. Some of those, like Poland and Estonia, were now spending more in percentage terms than the United States, and even most of those that were still missing the target, looking at you, Spain and Belgium, had still lifted their spending by something like 30% in percentage of GDP terms. You probably remember that at the time, there was a lot of hope these increases would solve one of the tensions at the heart of the NATO alliance, which, coupled with Vladimir Putin's very successful NATO recruitment efforts, would help tie the transatlantic alliance together even closer. As we've seen in recent weeks, though, since the election of President Donald Trump, that hasn't been how things have played out. And the big thing to say up front here is that while it's clear that things are changing, it's not clear how much they're changing. While it's long been expected and arguably attempted for the US to try and change the nature of its security relationship with Europe, planners have previously discussed some very different versions of what exactly that might look like. 3 scenarios you might want to imagine are a drawdown or burden shifting scenario where the US remains broadly committed within the existing NATO framework, but it decides to pull back some of the resources it dedicates to European security to put pressure on its allies to make up the difference. Not so much a change in policy or leadership so much as a change in resource levels. A more extreme scenario might be a larger scale military and political withdrawal, where the US essentially transfers responsibility for European security issues to the rest of NATO and its European partners, and basically says that while they're going to stay on the team, they're not willing to play captain anymore. A final, more dramatic option would be a true realignment. If drawdowns or withdrawals are about who funds the team or what America's position is on it, realignment covers scenarios where the US says it wants to be on a different team. And based on what we've seen out of the American leadership so far, I think there's still a lot of ambiguity over where future US policy is likely to sit, even if it's abundantly clear that it is changing. On the 12th of February, for example, the new US Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, gave a speech at the Munich Security Conference. In it, he appears to have put forward a vision of responsibility for European security shifting from the United States to the European allies. He said, and I quote, "The United States remains committed to the NATO alliance and to the defence partnership with Europe," end quote. But he also said he was there to, quote, "directly and unambiguously express that stark strategic realities prevent the United States of America from being primarily focused on the security of Europe," end quote. He suggested the United States could no longer be Europe's primary security guarantor, and when it came to security guarantees for Ukraine to make sure the war didn't just start up again after Russia had had a breath to regenerate, he suggested the peacekeepers in Ukraine would not be American troops, that they couldn't be sent within the bounds of a NATO mission, and they wouldn't be covered under Article 5. You take that all together, and I'd suggest it sounds mostly like a burden-shifting agenda. The United States has to focus elsewhere, so European security and this Ukraine thing, that's a European issue. So far, though, there doesn't appear to be any consensus on whether America is actually planning major drawdowns of its military forces in Europe, even between different European capitals. The Polish president has reportedly said that he's received assurances from the US that there's no intention to reduce the number of US troops in Eastern Europe, but Lithuania's foreign minister has described the period where Europe could rely on American troops as essentially over, even if there was no expectation that that change would take place tomorrow. While the future of US military commitments, however, might still be uncertain, I think we actually have significantly more evidence of major policy differences potentially dividing the alliance. Remember that in just the last couple of weeks, Trump has said that 25% tariffs on the European Union are coming, that the bloc was, quote, "formed to screw the United States," end quote, refused to rule out the prospect of using military force to take Greenland, which is an autonomous part of the Kingdom of Denmark, a NATO ally, and openly talked about making Canada the 51st US state, a policy goal which is fairly broadly opposed by some of the groups you'd expect to be involved in that kind of decision, like Canadians. And then if trade wars or debates over North American and Atlantic security weren't enough, we've also seen signs of major policy fissures over European security and specifically the war in Ukraine. What you can see on the right there is a photo from recent bilateral negotiations between the United States and Russia, hosted in Saudi Arabia, to which the Europeans in Ukraine were not invited, which, if you're a decision maker in a European capital, might raise a couple of questions. If the United States views the war in Ukraine as a primarily European issue and expects the Europeans to provide the money and peacekeepers to carry out any potential deal, why, some of them have asked, would it be the US negotiating the agreement? There's a very general rule that often holds in business as well as geopolitics that whoever's willing to put the money on the table, or in the case of warfare, the troops, is often going to be the one who gets the final say. And so the expectation might have been that if it was going to be the European credit card and European troops, including Ukrainian troops, on the table, that the Europeans and Ukrainians would have been at the table. We've also seen the United States very publicly break from previous allied positions on the war in Ukraine, most recently at the United Nations. There, following the 3rd anniversary of the Russian full-scale invasion, a resolution came up in the General Assembly to condemn the Russian invasion, endorse Ukraine's territorial integrity, and call on Russia to withdraw. A majority of the world's countries, more than 90, voted in favour, passing the resolution. A further 65 abstained, including the People's Republic of China. For its part, the United States actually voted against, joining such traditional American allies as Belarus, North Korea, and the Russian Federation, and officially publicly adopting a more pro-Russian position on this issue than China or Iran. Separately in the Security Council, where the US was able to introduce its own text, Russia voted in favour of the American resolution, which neither called Russia the aggressor nor acknowledged Ukraine's territorial integrity, while some traditional US allies issued fairly direct statements. The French ambassador reportedly said, quote, "There will be no peace and security anywhere if aggressions are rewarded and if the law of the jungle wins," end quote. While the UK ambassador said, quote, "No one wants peace more than Ukraine, but the terms of that peace matter. Only a just peace, one that honours the terms of our charter, will endure. And the terms of that peace must send a message that aggression does not pay. This is why there can be no equivalence between Russia and Ukraine in how this council refers to this war," end quote. And while all this has been playing out, you've also seen growing transatlantic tensions over other issues. For example, here's a recent quote from Germany. "Just look at the recent interference in the German election campaign by Mr. Elon Musk. This is a unique event. Washington's interference was no less dramatic, radical, and ultimately outrageous than the interference we observed from Moscow," end quote. And whatever your opinion on that statement or any of these statements, quotes like that do matter, because it came from this man, Friedrich Merz, who, after the recent German elections, is most likely to be the country's next chancellor. And despite once generally being regarded as falling strongly in the pro-American camp, as things have continued to escalate, it would be an understatement to say that Merz's position has shifted somewhat. Now, the clarion call of the hour appears to be for security independence. Merz reportedly said, quote, "For me, the absolute priority will be to strengthen Europe as quickly as possible, so that we can achieve real independence from the US step by step," end quote. We've also seen statements out of other NATO countries like the following from France, quote, "Although the Americans obviously remain our allies, we must no longer depend on them for our security," end quote. And even some of those in Europe who have been the strongest advocates of a very close relationship with the United States, Poland comes to mind here, with Prime Minister Donald Tusk recently warning against any power introducing what he described as some kind of competitive game between the European Union and United States. But even many figures like that, who are warning against a split, are still calling for major investments in Europe's own defensive capabilities. As for what those investments might be aiming to achieve, there are three elements I want to explore today. Firstly, sufficiency. How do the available resources compare to the likely tasks, like deterring Russia? Secondly, the replacement challenge. What's involved in making up for some of the key capabilities and elements the US currently provides? And finally, the magic I word, independence. What would be involved in putting the non-US allies in a position where they can make more of their security decisions with or without Washington's approval? Because putting on the defense economics hat for a moment, I'd argue it's probably not just about how many troops and how much equipment you have. It's about where that equipment comes from and who has a say in how you use it. Historically, at least some European commentators have been convinced that the United States would probably maintain its relationship with the European NATO allies, in part because even if some of the European nations were underspending on defense commitments, they were also buying a shit ton of American weapons. And that both helped generate scale in the US defense sector, which supported America's own defense capabilities, and transferred a lot of wealth from Europe to the States, creating often high-paying skilled jobs and driving tax revenues. But selling large amounts of American weapons, or even American components, also gave Washington another major policy advantage. When you buy from a country, you sign up to the conditions on how that product is used or transferred. And when buying American, that often means becoming very acquainted with four letters that I suspect will trigger a bit of an emotional response in many people in the sector. ITAR, the International Traffic in Arms Regulations. Through ITAR and other mechanisms, the US can often exercise considerable control over how its allies use or transfer their systems, even if the US component is only a very small part of the greater whole. Back in 2018, for example, the US was reportedly able to put the brakes on transfer of a French jet, the Rafale, and an Anglo-French cruise missile, the Storm Shadow or Scalp, to Egypt, with the reported problem here being the cruise missile, not the French jet itself. Some elements of the Scalp missile required US approval, and thus the whole missile did. Another example might be Saab's Gripen fighter jet. Overwhelmingly, that's a Swedish product. But that General Electric F414 power plant is red, white, and blue through and through. On one hand, those restrictions and controls can be used in a way that's eminently understandable. It kind of would have been awkward for the US to sell an F-35 to an ally back in the 2010s, for example, only for that ally to turn around to Beijing and say, "Hey mate, I've got something here you might be interested in." But at the same time, from a European perspective, it can open up the theoretical possibility of those same restrictions being used to constrain their policy options. If two different companies are in a competition to sell a fighter jet to a third country, one of them is probably going to be at a disadvantage if the other can decide that, yep, they're welcome to compete, as long as they do it without such optional extras as their engine, a third of their missiles, and some of their critical electronics. And as we've arguably seen in Ukraine, one of the most strategically impactful ways a country might choose to use its military equipment is by transferring them to a third country. something you might not be able to do if other countries control that export permission. It was Germany, for example, that had to give the go-ahead on other countries sending over their Leopard 2s. While even if the US didn't send any of its own F-16s, Washington still had to give the thumbs up to its allies choosing to do so. If allies want to be more independent of future US policy decisions, then it probably means having more systems in inventory, not subject to American logistics or American permissions. But in the context of defense industries that have become very intertwined over the past 3/4 of a century, that can be an expensive, difficult, but not insurmountable task. One big clue, then, about whether or not European and other allied leaders were serious about pursuing greater independence from the United States would be a market expectation of much greater investment and more purchases from European defense firms and other trusted suppliers, and perhaps a bit less emphasis on buying American products. And in recent weeks, we've seen a couple of movements on stock markets that might suggest a belief that yes, European countries are likely to ramp up defense spending, but not necessarily a belief that they're going to be buying American. Noting, of course, that I hope that everyone listening to this understands that this isn't and will never be financial advice. As at time of recording, the German defense giant Rheinmetall is up about 31% over the last month. And if you look at the chart on the right there, it's more like 30% over the last 2 weeks. For no particular reason, you'll notice I've drawn a vertical orange line on the chart. That marks the approximate time of the Hexes speech in Munich. And in what I'm sure is a completely unrelated phenomenon, the Rheinmetall share price appears to have started its lunar mission shortly thereafter. For Leonardo, the Italian giant, the gain was closer to 26% over the last month, with, again, a lot of that appreciation happening to the right of that orange line, while the Swedish Saab of Gripen and Carl Gustaf fame has picked up more than 33%, with the gain since 12 February being even more dramatic than that, given the stock was in a bit of a dip at that time. Some of the Korean defense giants that have been selling a lot of equipment into Europe saw even larger gains. Hanwha Artillery and Aircraft, for example, have made major sales into countries like Poland, with the degree of production localization very much on the agenda. In what might be a small clue about what the market expects for future sales in that direction, it may be interesting to note that over the last month, Hanwha Aerospace is up about 70%. Suffice to say that, historically speaking, that isn't exactly average behaviour for large established firms. A gain of 70% in a month might feel closer to loans at mafia interest rates than regular stock market operations. And across the board, you're talking about tens of billions of dollars in market cap being created over the space of a couple of weeks. Meanwhile, in the US, stock prices were going in the other direction. At time of recording, Lockheed Martin has lost about 11% over the last month, General Dynamics closer to 7%. And in a way, that's consistent with a broader trend we've seen since the closing days of 2024. Over a 6-month horizon, General Dynamics has shed closer to 15% and Lockheed Martin 21%. I'll leave it to the audience to interpret the drivers and the significance of that opposite direction of travel. A broad takeaway here is probably that at the moment, a lot of NATO members are highly reliant and dependent on the United States for supplies of platforms, munitions, and permissions. And if there is a major policy push to change that, it might require not just significant investments, but that those investments be made closer to home. But setting aside those industrial aspects of defense and policy independence for a moment, what about the more military elements? How would Allied military resources measure up against potential security challenges like deterring the Russian Federation, if you stop assuming that every war game, as I put it in the past, is going to end with Uncle Sam coming off the bench with the steel chair? If you take away Uncle Sam and his whacking stick, what's left in terms of troops and equipment? And as we go through this analysis, I want to flag that I'm looking at NATO without the United States because that's the military alliance, not the European Union. That means that mighty, mighty Canada, that is admittedly much more aligned on the Ukraine issue with European capitals than with Washington, D.C., is included in the data. Although given we're measuring military might, not politeness, it doesn't move the overall numbers that much. Some other non-EU inclusions, though, absolutely do. The UK is one of NATO's nuclear and naval heavy hitters, while, as we'll see a little bit later, Turkey brings a lot of ground combat mass to the table. Given that both are members of NATO and have been publicly supportive of Ukrainian independence, sovereignty, and territorial integrity, I'd argue they do belong in this data, along with countries like Norway. But just keep in mind that this isn't a purely European Union exercise. So we'll start with personnel counts, in part because one of the advantages we've seen Russia consistently try to leverage over the Ukrainians is the fact they've just been able to bring more troops and the larger military to the table. According to NATO data, in 2024, the US had about 1.3 million active duty personnel. The Russians had set a target, not yet hit, of 1.5 million active. And against those two massive forces, the rest of NATO, without their American component, could only muster a mere 2.1 million. The chart you can see on screen now shows NATO and military balance numbers for active, reserve, and paramilitary personnel the United States on the right, and the rest of NATO on the left. Even if you don't count paramilitaries at all, where America doesn't really have an equivalent to some of the European forces, the advantage in active duty personnel was about 1.6 to 1, and the advantage in reservists about 1.8 to 1. If Russia's unachieved goal for a wartime force is 1.5 million, a mobilized US military would be more than 2 million strong, while for the rest of NATO column, the active plus reserve number is more than 3.5 million. Put another way, a mobilized rest of NATO military would be numerically competitive with American and estimated Russian forces combined, and a peacetime rest of NATO military has more personnel than Russia's target wartime military. Even if you remove the single largest contributor, Turkey, the numbers for the rest of NATO still stack up fairly favourably compared to the United States. And the gap between those manning levels has actually increased significantly over the last decade. By NATO figures, the US military actually shrank slightly over that time period, while the rest of the NATO states, including those that weren't members in 2014, like Finland and Sweden, grew their total forces by about 230,000, with the majority of that increase coming from just one nation, Poland, effectively boosting NATO troop levels on the alliance's eastern flank by something like 117,000. This basic relationship, where the United States spends more money overall, but it's the allies that have significantly more personnel, especially in potential combat theatres, tends to hold whether you're looking at Europe or the Asia-Pacific. In a lot of escalation scenarios, it would generally be expected that the United States would provide a lot of the enablers, a lot of the firepower, and some of the most valuable combat units, but a majority of the mass, and presumably a significant majority of the casualties, would be borne by American allies, both because they have more personnel and because they tend to be closer to the potential line of fire. But while we've arguably seen in Ukraine that personnel counts can be absolutely vital, you can't exactly expect European militaries to hold off the Russians without equipment. Even a golf cart assault is going to be dangerous if you don't have anything to shoot at it. But at least on paper, for a lot of equipment categories, the non-US numbers are actually significantly higher than the American ones, and in many cases, significantly higher than what we might expect Russia to muster. As you can see on that chart there, with more than 6,300 tanks, the non-US states outnumber the American inventory by something like 2.4 to 1. And while no, you probably wouldn't want to take the likes of a Leopard 1 or M60 head-to-head with an American Abrams, there are probably going to be cases where mass matters, as does that ratio. For infantry fighting vehicles, it's 2.2 to 1. For self-propelled artillery, 3.5 to 1. And with a combined inventory of more than 25,000 APCs and infantry fighting vehicles, to say nothing of other related AFV types, that's presumably a lot of troops that aren't going to be walking. At sea, the on-paper advantage unsurprisingly shifts back to the Americans. The non-US states have more submarines in total, but the vast majority are smaller conventional boats, not the US nuclear-powered Leviathans. The non-US states have roughly 30 more principal surface combatants, but American ones tend to be high displacement, often more modern, although I'd argue including the LCS in the US figures probably does inflate them a bit. But on the other hand, each American supercarrier also only counts as one, each of which could probably project more power than some of these national navies. If you were to contrast those non-US figures with the Russian Navy, however, things look considerably more rosy. And over shorter distances, in the waters they were designed to and trained to fight in, the lethality gap between some of those modern conventional submarines and the larger nuke boats might not be as wide as you would think. Finally, in the air, it's once again advantage US, but the difference in quantities very much depends on what category you're talking about. The US, for example, has a monopoly within the alliance on strategic bombers, and dramatic advantages on some of the tools that you might associate with the need to project power over longer distances. Where the numerical gap tends to be more limited is in things like multi-role and air superiority fighters, interceptors, and attack jets. The chart obviously doesn't capture the massive technological advantage that something like an F-35 in either US or European inventory might enjoy over older fourth-generation aircraft. But even without making that adjustment, if all you had to go by were these numbers on the chart, you'd probably conclude that American air power, Air Force, Naval, and Marine Corps is collectively much more formidable than the rest of the NATO allies. An observation which probably matches the expectation that the US would be a major air power contributor in any major armed effort in which NATO was involved. But at the same time, you'd probably expect that it's Russia that's the most likely opponent for the non-US NATO air forces, not the Americans themselves. Those non-US figures are still sufficient to give a significant numerical advantage over the estimated fighter strength of the Russian aerospace forces. Some areas, like strategic bombers, would obviously favour the Russians, while other fleet elements, like fifth-generation fighter count, would be dramatically in the Blue Force's favour. A broad personal observation here would be that while many of these non-US inventories do sometimes show sign of long-term underinvestment and other issues, there is actually an enormous amount to work with here. And so if the goal is sufficiency to deter a Russian threat, or to replace the potential withdrawal of some US assets from Europe, it might be much more a case of solving specific issues and deficits, as opposed to having to build from the ground up. So then, let's start to unpick some of those potential issues and challenges. What do you mechanically need to do in order to make this force capable of deterring Russia, for example, without US involvement or assistance? Or at least with as little reliance on US assistance as possible. A lot of challenges here are going to flow from the fact that there has been plenty of time for NATO states to build their militaries with the rest of NATO in mind. On one hand, that makes great economic sense. You don't need to duplicate capabilities that everyone can share. You don't need 4 separate fleets of spy satellites, for example, if instead you can just have 1 or 2 and share the information amongst the alliance. Instead, countries can try to play to their strengths, specialise, and deliver as much value as possible with the funding they have available. One potential drawback of that approach, though, is that if you ever withdraw any of those presumed enablers, the rest of the force presumably becomes much less effective until those enablers can be replaced. And in the NATO context, indeed almost any context, the US is the king of a lot of these enablers. The non-US states have a lot of combat aircraft, for example, but are dramatically outnumbered when it comes to things like AWACS and tankers. And when it comes to satellites, whether that's missile warning, reconnaissance, or communication, there's really no comparing the US network to any of the others. Meaning if you suddenly strip all of that away, it would be kind of like the NATO alliance as a whole losing an eye. They'd still be able to see with their remaining sensors, but they'd lose that detail and metaphorical depth perception, leaving these kind of enablers as a potentially concerning gap. Now, obviously, Europe probably doesn't need as many of these types of assets as the US does because it's not really in the business of projecting power over long distances. The Polish Air Force probably isn't flying any trans-Pacific missions, nor does it have to go particularly far to come up against its primary opponent. Plus, because Europe is so compact and so heavily developed, you can put a lot more reliance on ground infrastructure. Wherever an airfight is taking place, it's probably not that far to an airbase or a civilian airport that could be repurposed for military use in time of war, and setting up a bunch of powerful ground radars and just pointing them east is probably going to give you a fairly useful picture. But you still might see European requirements here revised upwards if they no longer want to presume American support. Maybe in some cases it is possible to do without, but I'm not sure how many air planners out there would say they wish they had fewer tankers available. Then you'd have the twin challenges of fragmentation and deployability. Fragmentation is just shorthand for the general rule that, all else being equal, lots of small contingents from different militaries are going to have less combat power than those same resources concentrated in a single larger formation belonging to a single military. Even in the Ukrainian context where you only really have 2 main armies involved, we've still seen that concept play out, with Russia and now Ukraine moving to build up divisional and corps structures in order to better tie together and get the maximum possible performance out of their available lower-level units. The challenge then is how do you take contributions from smaller militaries that might only be able to contribute smaller units, say a single brigade, and glue those contributions together into something as cohesive and at least partially as effective as a larger American or French formation? How do you deal with the inefficiencies caused by things like duplication across multiple small forces, and all the other elements that can lead to an allied force feeling like it's lesser than the sum of its parts? And even if you can overcome that challenge, there's the issue of deployability. How do you actually get your units somewhere useful? For the American military, the solution is just to have an absurd amount of air and sea lift capacity. So you can just pick up entire formations, their personnel, equipment, and a couple of mobile Burger Kings, and send them anywhere in the world on relatively short notice. Meanwhile, for some NATO militaries, the challenge isn't much of a challenge. For troops in the Baltic states, for example, defensive deployability doesn't have to go that far beyond going outside, digging a trench in your backyard, and then waiting to see who turns up first, the Russians or the rest of NATO. But if your deterrence plan for Russia includes Spanish armoured formations, you better have a plan on how to get them from the Iberian Peninsula to the Baltic. Because even if you can snag a couple of thousand last-minute Ryanair tickets, I'm not sure how you're going to go getting a Leopard 2 into checked baggage. In other words, it's not enough just for these NATO states to have the people and the equipment. They're going to need a plan on how to form those into useful combat formations and get them where they need to be, which, given the current state of the Russian Navy, probably isn't a surprise amphibious assault on Portugal. A final technical challenge to flag is standardization, or rather the lack thereof. Make no mistake, NATO has succeeded in standardizing in a dizzying array of areas. But compared to major military forces like the People's Liberation Army, the Russian military, or the US military, the other NATO states operate a dizzying array of equipment. As an extreme example, the US has 1 type of main battle tank, the Abrams, plus whatever you count the Booker as. The Europeans also have the Abrams, but also various versions of the Leopard 2, the Challenger 2, the Leclerc, the Italian C1, the the South Korean K2, various Soviet, former Yugoslav or former Warsaw Pact designs, Leopard 1s, M48 patterns, M60 patterns, upgraded M60s with a 120mm gun, soon the new Altay main battle tank from Turkey. And that isn't even everything. That obviously limits your ability to run joint logistics or share replacements and spare parts in a crisis. And even when you talk about things that sound like they should be standardized, like 155mm artillery shells, you'll find that even there, the curse of proprietary solutions has managed to worm its way in over time, to the point where not every 155mm system is rated to fire every 155mm round, which again is just going to be another factor working against any attempt to make all of these little contributions greater than the sum of their parts. And that note about ammunition feeds into another area where reliance on the United States has been rather high. Historically, the United States has been the country in NATO with the largest stockpile of artillery ammunition, cruise missiles, or just about any relevant munition you care to name. And while there are a lot of factors that go into explaining why a lot of countries have arguably underinvested in maintaining their own stockpiles, part of the issue might have been the comforting belief that in the event of a crisis, America's stockpiles would come to the rescue. The problem comes when you realize the United States stockpile is only so large, and there are a lot of US allies that might be making that assumption. So while the United States might be well positioned to supply its allies in the event of a European escalation, or an issue in the Middle East, or an Asia-Pacific crisis, if you're worried about multiple issues potentially flaring up at the same time, or America not agreeing to supply things when you need it, you potentially have a problem. This is an example of the kind of thing that isn't immediately apparent when you just look at counts of platforms. It's fine to say that the Allies have lots of tanks, lots of artillery, or lots of aircraft. Arguably, it's even okay if a lot of those systems are on the older side. Lower spec equipment might still be useful for a bunch of lower risk duties, and it's not exactly like Russia is cranking out the T-14s and Sukhoi 57s. The far bigger challenge, I'd argue, is that if you don't have your logistics squared away, if you don't have the spare parts, the personnel, and the ammunition to make the best possible use of the equipment you do have, then your ability to leverage all of that metal into combat power and deterrence is going to be severely undermined, which naturally leads, I think, into the question of potential changes and priorities. Knowing what we know about what they do have and what they don't have, what might some of the non-US allies do if they're serious about rapidly building up defense autonomy? Keep in mind here, the goal isn't to provide a detailed blueprint on European rearmament, that'd be a heck of a consulting job, but instead just to flag some of the areas that we might expect to get some attention. The first category is what I'm calling the fight tonight column, the kind of things that enable countries to take the forces and equipment that they already have and boost their ability to fight as quickly as possible. And that's probably not going to be a bunch of shiny new platforms, it's going to be ammunition, it's going to be spare parts, it's going to be consumables, and the funding for maintenance and maintenance capacity to get readiness levels up. And the reason this might be so important isn't just because it can probably be done more cheaply and more quickly than buying a bunch of new tanks or aircraft, for example. It's because it can have such an outsized impact on the combat power and deterrence value of a force. If you have a fleet of 400 fighter aircraft but 200 are non-operational, and those would run out of missiles 3 days into a conventional war, then instead of rushing to buy a handful of additional aircraft, maybe you want to fix some of those that you currently have, and making sure that if your pilots do start trying to shoot down Russian MiGs and Sukhois using their cannon, that they're doing so for good reasons, like bragging rights and style points, not because the country is out of air-to-air missiles. The war in Ukraine has arguably served as a bit of a wake-up call as to just how quickly a conventional war can chew through munitions, and so building up stockpiles might seem like a reasonable place to start. Then, potentially more controversially, there might be discussions around the issue of Allied command. Partly to help control and coordinate all these different national elements in the event of a war, NATO does have a joint command structure. SHAPE, the Supreme Headquarters Allied Powers Europe, is based in Belgium. And at the apex of SHAPE is the somewhat humbly named Supreme Allied Commander Europe. And since the foundation of that position, the Supreme Allied Commander has always been an American officer, and the deputy always a European. For example, the commander and deputy commander roles were originally held by two obscure military officers from the US and Great Britain, General and later President Dwight Eisenhower, and Field Marshal Bernard Montgomery. For a significant part of the Cold War, there were two deputy commanders, but since 1993, there's only been one, with the role in order going to a Brit, then another Brit, followed by 2 Germans, and then 7 British officers in a row. Meanwhile, the variation on the commander side of the column has been limited to switching between various US branches. For decades, giving the Supreme Commander role to an American, often dual-hatting it with the head of US-European Command, has arguably always made a degree of sense. The United States was the most powerful alliance member, it was expected to bring the most to any potential military effort, and hence the expectation was that America's guy in Europe should hold the role. Going forward, though, if the US does decide it doesn't want to take the leading role on European security anymore, we may start to see at least discussion of whether that role should pass to an officer from a country that is willing to take that leading position. Inverting the relationship to give a US officer the deputy role would be one option, as would be dusting off the second deputy commander position, or getting creative with how leadership positions are filled. You could, for example, if you wanted to make sure headquarters meetings were often entertaining, appoint one American, one Western European, and then one from the alliance's eastern flank. Note, I'm not predicting any particular change. I just wanted to flag that a lot of NATO's command structures are essentially built up on the assumption that it's going to be the United States in the leading role. And if that reality ever changes, the command structures might have to as well. And if they don't, there might be more of an imperative to build up a parallel, more European alternative. Moving back to more mechanical questions then, are issues like how you might improve the deployability and credibility of the force. How do you try and minimize the fragmentation issue, or make sure you're better positioned to get the assets you do have to the front in the event of a crisis? This might be the domain of things like logistics exercises and planning, or the creation of joint units between various countries, so they can use the time luxury of peacetime to build coherent larger units out of smaller national contributions. But an element that's probably far more likely to draw press attention than logistical exercises or structural reforms is the question of nuclear deterrence. At the moment, NATO contains 3 nuclear weapon states, the US, France, and United Kingdom. For their nuclear deterrence requirements, all of the other countries in the alliance fall into one of 2 categories. Those that don't officially have any access to nuclear weapons and so de facto rely on the US nuclear umbrella. And then in the middle, there are the nuclear sharing states. This is a system whereby the US keeps a relatively small number of nuclear bombs stationed across 5 different countries in Europe: Belgium, Germany, Italy, the Netherlands, and Turkey. Those weapons are guarded by United States Air Force personnel, and it's the US that has the codes required to use them. But in the event of a crisis, it would be the aircraft of the host nation that would be responsible for actually delivering the bombs. In the coming years, for example, the Luftwaffe's F-35s would have responsibility for delivering the weapons in Germany if necessary. But short of pulling an absolute gamer move and finding a way to bypass a permissive action link, there's no way for Germany to actually use those devices without America's go-ahead. The idea is basically to give the nuclear-sharing nations an option between nothing and building their own weapons. If, however, alliance leaders start to believe that they might not be able to take US nuclear protection for granted in the future, there might be a push for alternatives. An extreme and probably unlikely option at this point is additional proliferation, new NATO members becoming nuclear weapon states. But a less extreme option, and one we've already started to see some discussion around, is better leveraging the 2 European nuclear arsenals. By virtue of their submarine-based deterrence, both the UK and France are potential candidates for providing a nuclear umbrella. But of the 2, only France is really in a position to duplicate any of the effect we see with the current nuclear sharing arrangements. The UK has its nuclear submarines and SLBMs, but that's all it has. And a Trident missile wouldn't exactly be my first choice for tactical employment or a nuclear warning shot. France, however, does have an air-delivered nuclear weapon specifically designed for that tactical or warning shot role. Macron has openly suggested that there is a European dimension to French nuclear strategy, and there have been some reports suggesting that Paris might be considering the option of forward deploying a small number of Rafales, potentially armed with nuclear weapons, to German air bases. That obviously isn't a done deal, and what we've heard from Merz so far is only that there is a need to talk to Britain and France about whether their nuclear protection could also be extended to Germany, and also that, quote, "We must talk to each other about what that could look like," end quote. French nuclear weapons in Germany wouldn't be a direct replacement for American nuclear sharing, since the weapons would presumably be delivered by French aircraft, not German ones, which aren't compatible with the ASMPA missile, but at the same time it would put NATO nuclear weapons in Germany that aren't reliant on US control. To be fair, this probably isn't how some of the first advocates of the French nuclear deterrent expected their first weapons would arrive on German soil, but from a strategic perspective, times do change, and the impetus might now be there. Then you can start to think about some of the potential longer-term considerations. For example, how might the Allies go about replacing some of those critical American enablers? We saw NATO move towards acquiring 6 E-7 AWACS aircraft back in 2023, for example, but from space-based assets to communication and logistics, if the non-US allies want to seriously scale up the amount of these capabilities they have in-house, so to speak, you're probably looking at a lot more future investment. That in turn might lead into the kind of difficult alliance-wide questions that could easily command their own episodes. What's their industrial strategy look like? How do they balance protecting national industries against maximizing alliance-wide output and efficiency? How much cost and performance are you willing to trade off in order to avoid reliance on American systems or components? And is the goal complete independence in everything, including very advanced platforms like sixth-generation fighters? Or is it enough simply to reduce the reliance on US supply lines and US permissions? And in the process of reducing reliance on those supply lines, how much are the various allies willing to still accept reliance on each other? Is the goal scale and efficiency through the production of new standardized products? Or is the goal of the investment not just allied strategic autonomy, but national autonomy as well? Those questions, as well as debates around broader standardization of Europe's very much non-standard militaries, may well end up going hand in hand, with answers that generally drift towards "it depends." But even just getting the kind of things we're talking about in place would obviously require a lot of investment. And so I think we have to pivot away from talking about the equipment itself towards the economics behind paying for it. There's a lot more that goes into the health of an economy and its ability to support rearmament than just its headline GDP figures. But at the same time, looking at the overall size of the economy probably does give us some clue into what kind of resources might be available, at least at a very high level. And in that respect, the non-US members face a kind of good news, bad news situation. The bad news is that building up towards true security independence from the United States is likely to be expensive. The good news is that collectively, their economies have some fairly broad shoulders. In nominal GDP terms, according to NATO's data, the United States and the non-US members are relatively closely matched. 28.7 trillion US dollars for the United States, 25.3 for everyone else. As you can see from the chart there, that means that in nominal terms, the rest of NATO has a larger economy than the People's Republic of China. While Russia at the bottom there, at least without any purchasing power parity adjustments, is kind of an afterthought. And so a major, if somewhat obvious takeaway here is that while part of the gap between US and allied defense expenditure is driven by the slightly larger US economy, the primary driver is just that those other allies collectively dedicate so much less of their economy to defense. In 2024, NATO estimated the US defense budget at $967.7 billion. The other members, despite collectively having an economy in the same ballpark as the States, spent just over half that, $506.7 billion. But to be fair, a straight nominal comparison here probably doesn't tell the whole story, especially if you're talking about the prospect of rearmament, because as hilarious and allegorical as it might be, you don't actually win wars by dropping pallets of greenbacks on your opponents. Money has to be converted into combat power, which is where purchasing power parity comes in. And if not for the fact that lower cost economies can often source manpower or produce equipment at a lower cost, then Beijing would basically still be stuck at the starting line when it comes to potential military competition with the United States, and the Russian military would probably be considered a conventional threat to a single large NATO country like Germany, as opposed to the entire alliance. To get a better idea of how far a budget stretches, in the past when talking about Russia and China, I've used military PPP multipliers calculated by Professor of Economics Peter Robertson of the University of Western Australia. And while Europe, as many potential tourists would be aware, does feature some very high-cost economies, it also features quite a few where a dollar or euro will stretch considerably further. And so what I thought I'd do was pull the multipliers calculated for various NATO states, compare them to the estimated 2024 spend from those countries, and see if it shifted this view a little. And in a way it does, if by a little you actually mean halving the gap. Adjusting for PPP would indicate that very roughly that $500 billion of expenditure in the non-US members actually has about as much buying power as $750 billion would in the United States. That might sound strange when you consider the scale of advantage the United States has in nuclear weapons, space assets, their air force, and their navy. But remember that, unless you're North Korea, people are often going to be one of the most expensive things a military invests in. And the other members have to find enough budget to maintain, collectively, a much larger force. Whatever the buying power of the existing budget, though, you'd presume that in order to improve things significantly, those budgets probably have to increase. Many countries in NATO have already voiced a support for increasing the 2% target. Some, like Poland, have already sailed far past that. But every member jumping their spending levels above that of the United States is probably a bit of a stretch. But what would happen if instead the new target was set at something much more reasonable? The UK has just announced they're going to go to 2.5%, so perhaps let's start there. Raise the target to 2.5% and then assume that everyone actually reaches that target, and you'd add an extra $137 billion per year to that original $507 billion spent. That would bring the new nominal total to roughly $643 billion, and presumably give these countries quite a lot of room on the annual shopping list. For the record, that's roughly enough to buy about 10 Gerald R. Ford-class supercarriers every year, or cut a few carriers to also buy hundreds of jets, thousands of cruise missiles, hundreds of tanks and artillery pieces, and enough FPV drones to give every household on the eastern flank a box of the things, just in case the Russians came knocking. Not enough, perhaps, to level things out with the United States, but certainly enough for a significant build-up. given you'd basically be suggesting hiking non-US NATO defense spending by a number very close to Cypri's $140 billion estimate for Russia's entire 2024 defense budget. As a general rule, it can get hard to compete in arms races when your opponent can casually announce increases equivalent to your entire spending. Notably though, Washington hasn't been pushing to increase the spending target to 2.5% of GDP. They've been pushing for 5%. That number, which would basically represent a return to Cold War levels, has already been fairly publicly rejected by a number of European leaders. Some of those objections might be on boring economic grounds, like this representing a threat to their fiscal sustainability. Most European economies are fairly sluggish at the moment, and a lot of them are going to have competing financial priorities. But another objection, or argument in favour of the plan, depending on your point of view, is just that it would likely represent titanic overkill. Assuming the United States itself didn't adopt the 5% target, pushing the rest of the alliance to the 5% level wouldn't just catch them up with the United States, it would actually push them ahead of the US. In nominal terms, the 5% target would add roughly $750 billion per year to the existing $506 billion per year spend, for a total of about $1.25 trillion a year. And if you apply those PPP multipliers we were using just a second ago, you get this. In buying power terms, it might feel like adding $1.06 trillion to the budget. Or in other words, it would feel like increasing the non-US budgets by the US budget, giving a total spend in PPP terms of more than $1.8 trillion. Now, obviously, if your goal is just to deter Russia, this might be a step or three further than you have to go. And so I'd suggest the 5% target might be more of an American negotiation technique than a genuine target. And indeed, from a US perspective, you might actually be nervous if Europe went ahead and adopted this. 5% isn't a spending plan for a military capable of competing with Russia. On paper, it's not even the budget you'd need for a force capable of competing with the United States or China. It's more the scope of what you might need if you intended to compete with the US and China at the same time. Meanwhile, if we flip back to nominal figures and assume the United States does follow that 5% figure, things get even sillier. In that scenario, the US would be adding an extra $469 billion in spending over 2024 levels. Defense stock prices would presumably reach the moon before many national space agencies, and through that combined $1.22 trillion increase, total NATO defense spending would approach $2.7 trillion per year. To put that into perspective, to match those spending levels dollar for dollar, Russia would have to increase defense spending to 100% of GDP and then keep increasing. Assuming the Russian military and other competitors are unlikely to gain access to replicator technology in the near future, these kind of numbers would probably represent a reality-bending level of overkill from a deterrence perspective. At those kind of spending levels, I half expect engineers would be jostling position on the programs building NATO's new space battle fleet. And so I think at a general level, far more constrained increases are probably more likely. Numbers from 2.5% to 3% have been tossed around in the United States and Germany, but we'll see where the alliance lands. The broader point here, though, is that when you look at this economic analysis, as well as the platform and personnel counts we went through earlier, it's hard to avoid the conclusion that increased defense independence from the United States is something the Allies very much could achieve. As an outsider looking in, it sometimes feels like some Europeans are actually quick to downplay the military strength of their countries. Many Germans, for example, seem almost uncomfortable with the idea of a powerful Bundeswehr, and there's sometimes a tendency in some circles to overemphasize some of the very real problems that exist in European militaries, while also sometimes exaggerating the strength of Russia or other potential threats. A lot of these allied militaries do have enormous issues born of protracted underinvestment. They do sometimes lack critical enablers, sufficient munitions, and suffer from readiness issues. But at the same time, a huge amount of the equipment, the people, and the economic resources you'd need to make this work are already there. Choosing to spend what's needed to fix the problems, however, is ultimately a question of political will and potentially some hard trade-offs, while making sure that resources dedicated actually solve problems, rather than just going up in a giant bureaucratic money-burning bonfire, is probably more a matter of things like prioritization, planning, and effective execution. On paper, Allied security independence looks like a doable objective, but whether or not that objective can actually be reached probably hinges on a wide array of unknowns. It presumes, for example, that there's general unity across the European parts of the alliance that this is something worth doing. The numbers I just showed you don't presume that a couple of countries lift their game, it presumes that all of them do. And especially when you're talking about EU-level investments and initiatives, there's always the potential danger of spoilers. And it's entirely possible that even just one or two member states might be able to block or at least slow down any kind of Europe-wide defence initiative. Similarly, it also presumes that each of the allies with specialist or valuable military and economic resources is willing to bring them to the table. Europe doesn't have its own nuclear deterrent unless France and Britain are willing to provide it. And a lot of the alliance's ground combat strength and equipment inventory, which would be particularly relevant in any potential escalation with Russia, are controlled by a relatively small number of countries, two of which, Turkey and Greece, spend a lot of their time pointing their enormous arsenals at each other. As you can see on screen there, for example, if you exclude the United States, nearly 2/3 of NATO's tanks are controlled by only three countries: Turkey, Greece, and Poland. If you look at self-propelled guns, towed artillery, or multiple rocket launchers, you see a similar phenomenon. To say the quality levels aren't always there would be an understatement, but in raw quantitative terms, once again, you see a lion's share controlled by only a couple of countries. Once again, Turkey and Greece, but also Finland and Romania. The point is, different nations tend to bring different things to the alliance table, and the more of them don't buy into the overall vision, the greater the chances that you're missing out on something vital. Without the likes of Turkey, Greece, and Poland, the resulting force might be short on mass. Take away the UK, France, and Italy, and you lose a lot of your naval strength, your AWACS, your tankers, and all of your nuclear weapons. And whether you're talking about German aircraft, Nordic submarines, and even the tiny nation of Luxembourg that decided to support the wider alliance by launching a military satellite and is now discussing launching a second, the point is if you're trying to replace the contribution of a force that has every specialty, like the US military, the rest of NATO really needs everyone else to bring their specialties to the table. As long as the United States remains the continent's primary security guarantor, any kind of division or shortages can potentially be papered over. But if you take away that assumption, unity and cooperation amongst the remaining members becomes all the more important. And it remains to be seen whether that kind of unity will hold when it becomes times for plans to be made and money to be spent. As we get towards the end, though, I think it's worth noting there's a massive wildcard in all of this speculation. What happens to Ukraine? Because while I've tried to separate the issues of the United States, the other NATO allies, and Russia-Ukraine, in so many ways Ukraine is just such an important piece of the overall puzzle, it's kind of hard to piece together a projection for Europe's future defence needs without knowing what state Ukraine is in and what side it's on. In the short term, one of the things the Ukrainians have probably already given to the rest of Europe is time. While you might think a direct Russian invasion of a NATO state is probably deeply unlikely even at the best of times, it's probably just outright unthinkable with so much of their military tied up in Ukraine. Plus, every Russian tank that's destroyed, missile that's fired, or aircraft that's either shot down or just ages out due to constant use is, all else being equal, one more that Russia's going to have to replace before it can test the Allies. And then beyond that, when the war eventually ends, there's a question of what happens to Ukraine's military capacity. Even if demobilized down to peacetime levels, this is still a force likely to be several 100,000 strong, positioned basically exactly where you'd want it if your goal was to defend the rest of Europe from a potential Russian attack. There is no other force in NATO, including the United States, that has more troops with experience fighting this kind of large-scale peer conflict. And in the event of a future escalation and the shit hitting the fan somewhere else, say the Baltic states or along the Finnish border, I think it's fair to assume that if the Ukrainians were willing to mobilize and fight as a society, even when they were fighting basically alone, they'd be willing to do it again if they were now fighting shoulder to shoulder with their allies, and the Rafales and Eurofighters were streaking overhead. Historically, a lot of NATO planning for a potential escalation with Russia has required shipping in hundreds of thousands of extra troops from places as far away as the United States, and then trying to rush them to the front fast enough to make a difference. But if you add the Ukrainians, you don't have to ship them to the front, they live there. And I think they've proven by now a pretty stern desire to keep it that way. There's also the prospect of integrating Ukraine's PPP-advantaged defence sector. Ukraine claims to have produced 150 155mm self-propelled guns in 2024, for example, which is more than any other NATO member. And Ukraine is now churning out militarised drones, literally by the millions. When it comes to drone and anti-drone warfare, I'd argue that Ukraine and Russia are now the most experienced forces on the planet. And so bringing that experience, that capability into the broader European security framework might act as a kind of shortcut to catapult forward what allied militaries are capable of doing in that area. We've already seen Ukrainian troops receive training in NATO countries, but it might make sense in future to reverse the process, getting experienced Ukrainian drone operators into NATO forces to teach some of the lessons they've learned at such high cost. If, on the other hand, Ukraine isn't brought into the European security framework, whether that be through the European Union, NATO, or some other agreement, all of those potential advantages from a European perspective potentially become risks. What happens to all of Ukraine's arms production? What happens to those experienced drone operators that are now presumably out of a job? What happens to a heavily damaged country filled by hundreds of thousands of combat veterans who might now feel betrayed by their former allies? Most of these are issues we can get into more when we talk about Ukraine in the future. But if you're looking at things from a raw numbers perspective, the European NATO allies have a lot more to gain by bringing Ukraine into the tent than a far more distant USA might. And just how easy it is for the non-US allies to build up their combined military strength, independent of Washington, may depend a lot on what you assume the future of Ukraine is on the scale from integrated ally to Russian-dominated opponent. A closing observation at the end here then is that so much of this remains uncertain. At time of recording, we're just over a month into the new US administration, and given how much US policy has changed over that month, it's entirely possible it shifts again and again and again over the next 4 years. But even if some of this American realignment doesn't play out, I think the evidence suggests that enough has already happened to highlight the potential risks to the other NATO members. Many decision makers appear to be taking the view, far more often than in the past, that a greater degree of defence autonomy from the United States isn't just worth the cost, it's a strategic imperative. And if that perceived urgency is converted into effective action, then on paper, the resources are there to reach that objective. What remains to be seen now is whether the political will is there to make it happen. Back in 2022, we showed that the Western allies combined had the resources necessary to provide Ukraine an overwhelming amount of support if they chose to do so. In the end, the support we did see was much more muted, constrained, and often held back by fears around things like escalation. Now, for the second time in just over 3 years, we might be at another inflection for Allied security policy, especially in Europe. Whether this time the will and resources will follow from the political rhetoric, only time will tell. Which brings us to the channel update. I think it's worth saying up front that calling the last couple of weeks eventful would be something of an understatement. And as I flagged up front, that means there's going to be a lot to cover in terms of the potential impacts and shifts and how they relate to the United States, Russia, and Ukraine. The reason I decided to look at the European defence side of the problem first, however, is because it's the one where things are the most settled. The idea of what it would take to build more European defence autonomy and independence from the US in security matters isn't exactly a new concept. And so now that it's clear that many European politicians might be pushing in that strategic direction, I felt confident jumping in to have a look at the state of play, the economics, the inventories, and what might be involved. When it comes to the other two elements though, I'm not entirely sure the smoke has settled enough for a video yet. I'll keep an eye on things over the next couple of days and weeks, but I don't want to jump the gun and make a video guessing what the potential implications might be for the States or Ukraine, only for those projections to be torpedoed by a new announcement 6 hours before the video is due to go live. If I think things are clear enough, we'll start to unpack those issues next week. If not, we'll pivot to another topic for a week or two, and then come back once I'm confident making a video. I know that may not represent the fastest turnaround, but I generally want to focus on getting things done right, not getting them done quick. Beyond that, let me just say thank you to all of you for your ongoing support and engagement as always. I genuinely hope that you got something out of the episode, and so with my thanks to you and sponsor Odoo, I hope to see you all again next week.